The click of a titanium deadbolt echoing through a sterile operating room was the loudest sound in Chicago that night. Blood pooled on the porcelain tiles. A Smith & Wesson pressed against the surgeon's spine. She had just saved his greatest rival. Now, the devil was demanding his turn. The rain in Chicago always felt heavier on the south side, as if the city itself was trying to wash away sins that had been baked into the concrete for a century. Doctor. Natalie Brooks stood at the stainless steel sink of her underground clinic, aggressively scrubbing her hands with iodine. Above her, the muffled rumble of the L-train violently rattled the flickering fluorescent lights. 3 years ago, Natalie had been a rising star, a premier trauma surgeon at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She had a sprawling apartment in the Gold Coast, a pristine white coat, and a future mapped out in medical journals. But the polished floors of corporate medicine hid a rot she could no longer stomach: the insurance denials. The bureaucratic red tape that left the city's most vulnerable bleeding out in waiting rooms, while billionaires received VIP suites for minor ailments. So, she walked away. She took her trust fund, bought a defunct meatpacking warehouse off Halsted Street, and converted the basement into a state-of-the-art, off-the-books trauma center. She treated undocumented immigrants, battered women, and anyone who couldn't afford the exorbitant price of survival in America. Unfortunately, providing a safe haven in the shadows meant the shadows occasionally bled into her clinic. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the reinforced steel doors of the loading dock blew open. The storm outside howled into the corridor, bringing with it the metallic stench of copper and damp wool. "Doc, we need you, now." Natalie dried her hands and sprinted toward the triage bay. 3 men in soaking wet, charcoal suits were dragging a 4th man through the entrance. They left a thick, dark trail of arterial blood across the linoleum. "Get him on table 1, watch his head," Natalie commanded, her voice slicing through the chaos with practiced authority. She didn't need to ask how the man got hurt. The ragged, smoking holes in his designer jacket told the whole story. As the men hoisted the victim under the harsh surgical lights, Natalie's breath hitched. She recognized the face instantly. It was a face plastered across confidential FBI dossiers and whispered about in the darkest corners of the city's underbelly. Hector Sullivan. He was the ruthless architect of the Irish syndicate that controlled the docks at O'Hare and the illegal weapons trade flooding the Midwest. He was a monster who had ordered hits on judges, journalists, and rival families, and right now he was dying on her table. 2 gunshot wounds to the upper right thorax. One of the men barked, pressing a bloody towel to Sullivan's chest. "We were ambushed on Lower Wacker, Costa's men. They knew our route." Costa. The name sent a shiver down Natalie's spine. Gabriel Costa. He was the reigning king of Chicago's criminal empire, a phantom who ran the city's narcotics and extortion rings with chilling precision. If Sullivan was here, bleeding out from a hit ordered by Gabriel Costa, Natalie's clinic was no longer a sanctuary. It was ground zero for a mafia war. "You have to leave," Natalie said, snapping on a pair of latex gloves. "If Costa's men tracked you." "We lost them," the bleeding man's lieutenant snarled, drawing a Glock from his waistband. "You're going to fix him, Doc, or the next bullet goes in your knee." Natalie didn't flinch. She had been threatened by scarier men than a panicked thug. She looked down at Sullivan. His skin was ashen, his lips tinted blue. The pulse at his carotid was a weak, fluttering thread. He was drowning in his own blood. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. She had taken an oath. It didn't matter that the man on the table was responsible for widows and orphans. Right now, he was just a failing biological machine, and she was the mechanic. "Put the gun away and step outside, or he dies in 3 minutes, Natalie ordered, her tone ice cold. "I need an airway, Stat. Prep him for a thoracotomy." For the next 2 hours, Natalie existed in a state of hyper-focused flow. She intubated the mob boss, her hands moving with mechanical precision. She made the incision between his ribs, the scalpel slicing through skin and muscle. The damage was catastrophic. One of the hollow point rounds had nicked the pulmonary artery, filling the pleural cavity with blood. "Suction! Give me more suction!" she yelled to her sole assistant, a terrified former combat medic named Leo. She waded into the crimson pool, her gloved fingers blindly searching for the source of the hemorrhage. It was a brutal, intimate dance with death. She clamped the artery, sutured the tearing tissue, and slowly, agonizingly, pulled Hector Sullivan back from the brink of hell. By 4:30 a.m., the monitors were beeping with a steady, rhythmic reassurance. Sullivan's chest rose and fell evenly on the ventilator. He was alive. Natalie stepped back from the table, her scrubs soaked in the blood of a kingpin. She pulled off her mask, gasping for the cool, filtered air of the OR. She had done it. She had saved him. She had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The quiet that followed a grueling surgery was always a heavy, suffocating blanket. Natalie sat in her tiny office at the end of the hall, nursing a lukewarm cup of black coffee. She stared at the CCTV monitors mounted on the wall. Sullivan's men were pacing the alleyway outside, smoking cigarettes, their weapons poorly concealed under their coats. She rubbed her temples, feeling the sharp sting of an impending migraine. She needed to arrange an anonymous ambulance transport to get Sullivan out of her clinic before sunrise. The longer he stayed, the higher the risk. On the grainy black and white monitor, the alleyway suddenly went completely dark. Natalie frowned, leaning closer to the screen. The exterior floodlights had been cut. A second later, the video feed from camera 3 facing the loading dock turned to static. Then camera 2. Then camera 1. Her heart dropped into her stomach. A muffled thwip, thwip, thwip echoed from the stairwell. Suppressed gunfire. "Leo," Natalie whispered into her two-way radio. "Leo, lock down the wards, now." There was no answer, only the chilling sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps descending the concrete stairs into the basement. Natalie leaped from her chair, her survival instincts kicking in. She scrambled toward the secure operating room where Sullivan was recovering. She had to hit the panic button to alert the CPD, even if it meant exposing her entire operation. Before she could reach the door, the main corridor lights shattered in a cascade of sparks. In the dim emergency red lighting, shadows detached themselves from the walls. 3 men dressed in tactical gear swept through the hallway, moving with terrifying military efficiency. They didn't shout, they didn't make demands. They were an execution squad. Natalie froze behind a medical supply cart, clutching a heavy defibrillator paddle to her chest as a pathetic weapon. Then he walked in. He didn't wear tactical gear. He wore a bespoke, midnight blue Tom Ford suit, the fabric clinging perfectly to his broad shoulders. He walked with a terrifying, unhurried grace, like a predator strolling through a cage of sleeping mice. His face was a masterpiece of cold, aristocratic cruelty, high cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic Ocean. Gabriel Costa. He paused in the center of the clinic, looking around at the makeshift hospital with an expression of mild amusement. "Clear the rooms." Gabriel's voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent tremors through the floorboards. "Find Sullivan. Put a bullet in his head. Leave the staff alive unless they interfere." Natalie's breath hitched. They were going to murder a helpless patient in her clinic. She couldn't let that happen. It went against every fiber of her being. "He's not here!" Natalie shouted, stepping out from behind the cart, her voice trembling but defiant. Gabriel stopped. He turned slowly, his piercing eyes locking onto her. He looked at her blood-soaked scrubs, the exhaustion painting dark circles under her eyes, and the defiant set of her jaw. A slow, dangerous smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Dr. Brooks, I presume," Gabriel said, taking a step toward her. "I must say, your reputation precedes you." The fallen angel of Northwestern Memorial, now playing Florence Nightingale for the city's worst scum. "Get out of my clinic," Natalie demanded, standing her ground even as his towering frame cast a shadow over her. "I will, as soon as I finish the trash you so graciously tried to recycle," Gabriel replied, gesturing toward the heavy steel door of the primary OR. "He's in there, isn't he? I can hear the ventilator. He's a patient. He's under my care. You are not going in there." Gabriel chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a sleek, suppressed 9mm pistol. "Doctor, you have an inflated sense of your own authority. Move aside." Before Natalie could react, the screech of tires echoed from the street above, followed by the shattering of the basement's upper windows. Sullivan's men hadn't been completely eliminated. They had called for backup, and the backup had arrived. The clinic erupted into a chaotic war zone. Automatic gunfire tore through the ceiling, raining drywall and glass down upon them. Gabriel's men instantly returned fire, diving behind reception desks and medical cabinets. "Boss, we're flanked!" one of Gabriel's men yelled, dropping to the floor as a volley of bullets shredded the wall behind him. Gabriel cursed in rapid Italian. He grabbed Natalie by the arm, his grip like a steel vise, and dragged her behind a reinforced concrete pillar just as a barrage of bullets ripped through the space where she had been standing seconds before. The noise was deafening, the air filled with the thick, choking smoke of cordite and the screams of dying men. It was a slaughter. Sullivan's reinforcements were heavily armed with military-grade rifles, pinning Gabriel and his small strike team down in the open corridor. "You led us into a trap," Gabriel roared over the gunfire, pinning Natalie against the pillar. "I didn't do anything. They're his men," Natalie screamed back, covering her ears. Gabriel leaned out to fire a suppressed shot, dropping an attacker at the end of the hall, but as he turned back, a thunderous crack echoed from the adjacent stairwell. A stray bullet, fired from a high-caliber rifle, punched straight through the drywall and caught Gabriel in the side. He let out a sharp guttural grunt. The impact spun him around, and he slammed back into the pillar, sliding down to one knee. "Gabriel!" one of his men shouted, breaking cover to reach him, only to be cut down instantly by a hail of gunfire. Natalie watched in horror as the invincible Mafia boss clutched his abdomen. Dark, almost black blood began seeping through the fingers of his pristine white dress shirt. He had been hit, and hit badly. The clinic was lost. Sullivan's men were advancing, kicking open doors, executing the wounded. They were coming to secure their boss and kill everyone else. Gabriel looked up at Natalie. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, desperate calculation. He grabbed her scrub top, pulling her face down to his. "Get us into that room," he hissed, blood staining his teeth. Now, Natalie didn't think. She acted on pure adrenaline. She hauled Gabriel up, throwing his heavy arm over her shoulder. He was pure muscle, incredibly dense and heavy, but the fear of the approaching death squad gave her unnatural strength. Together, they stumbled across the bullet-riddled hallway, slipping on the blood-slicked floor. Bam! 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 Footsteps were rounding the corner. Shouts in a thick Irish brogue echoed down the hall. "Check the back! Find Costa!" Natalie slammed her hand against the biometric scanner next to the primary operating room. The light flashed green. The heavy, lead-lined steel door hissed open. She shoved Gabriel inside, dragged herself in after him, and slammed her palm against the emergency lockdown button. 4 distinct heavy metallic thuds echoed as the titanium deadbolts slid into place, securing the door to the reinforced concrete frame. It was a security measure Natalie had installed specifically to withstand police battering rams. Nothing short of C4 explosives was getting through that door. That were sealed in. The room was bathed in the harsh, white glare of the surgical lamps. In the center of the room, completely oblivious to the massacre outside, Hector Sullivan slept peacefully on the operating table, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. Gabriel collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor, leaving a thick smear of crimson against the white tiles. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He dropped his gun on the floor, pressing both hands against his bleeding side. Natalie stood frozen, chest heaving. She looked from the comatose Sullivan to the bleeding Costa. The 2 most dangerous men in Chicago were in her operating room. One was her patient. The other was her prisoner. Or was she his? "You!" Gabriel gasped, his head lolling to the side. He managed to lift the Smith & Wesson, his hand shaking violently, and pointed it squarely at her chest. "You saved him." The opening hook's reality crashed over her, the click of a deadbolt echoing in an operating room, blood pooling on the tiles, a gun pressed to her well, aimed at her. "Put the gun down, Costa. You're going into hemorrhagic shock," Natalie said, her medical training overriding her terror. "You saved my enemy," Gabriel whispered, a delirious, dangerous light in his eyes. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. The doctor tried to save his enemy. What a tragic headline. Outside the door, fists began to pound against the steel. Muffled shouts drifted through the heavy metal. "They're locked in. Get the cutting torches from the maintenance closet." Gabriel laughed, a dark, raspy sound that turned into a grimace of pain. "Do you hear that, doctor? Sullivan's dogs are going to burn their way in here. They'll wake up their master, and then they'll skin us both alive." "I am a civilian," Natalie snapped, slowly stepping toward him with her hands raised. "They have no reason to kill me." You witnessed them butcher my men. You've seen their faces. You're already dead, sweetheart, Gabriel sneered. He let his head fall back against the wall, his eyes fluttering closed for a terrifying second before snapping open again. Unless what? Gabriel forced himself to look at her. The arrogance was bleeding out of him, leaving raw, primal desperation. He slowly lowered the gun, letting it rest on his knee, still pointed in her general direction. The Mafia boss locked the doors, Gabriel whispered, his voice losing its thunder, dropping to a gravelly plea, and said, "Now save me too." Natalie stared at him. The irony was suffocating. The man who had broken into her sanctuary to murder her patient was now demanding she save his life. "You want me to operate on you?" she asked, her voice incredulous. "While your enemy's men are literally burning down the door?" "I want you to do what you do best, Doctor," Gabriel rasped. "Keep me alive long enough for my extraction team to arrive. My brother knows my coordinates. He'll bring an army. We just need to buy time." Natalie looked at his wound. The bullet had entered his right flank, just below the ribs. Depending on the trajectory, it could have shredded his liver, his kidney, or his ascending colon. If she did nothing, he would bleed to death internally in less than 20 minutes. "Get on the secondary table," Natalie ordered, her voice hardening. She kicked his dropped gun across the floor, out of his reach. "If I'm doing this, I'm doing it my way." Gabriel gritted his teeth, using the wall to drag himself up. He stumbled toward the stainless steel prep table adjacent to Sullivan's. He stripped off his ruined suit jacket and ripped open his bloody shirt, revealing a torso scarred by old violence and the fresh, bubbling puncture wound of the new. Natalie quickly prepared an IV line and a fresh tray of instruments. "I don't have an anesthesiologist. My medic is either dead or hiding. I have to put you under with a propofol push, but I can't monitor your vitals perfectly while I'm operating." "No," Gabriel snapped, his hand shooting out to grip her wrist. His skin was freezing, a sign of severe blood loss. "No anesthesia." "Are you insane?" "I have to open your abdomen and dig through your organs to find the bullet and the bleeder. The pain will send you into cardiac arrest." "If I go to sleep, I might not wake up," Gabriel said, his eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "Local anesthetic only. Numb the skin. I need to be awake. If they breach that door while I'm unconscious, we're both dead." "I can't operate on a thrashing patient." "I won't move," he promised, his voice a low, gravelly vow. "Do it, doctor." Outside, the high-pitched whine of an acetylene torch started up. A bright orange glow began to heat the edges of the steel door. Sparks showered onto the linoleum in the hallway. They had maybe 45 minutes before the door gave way. Natalie grabbed a syringe of lidocaine and began injecting it in a wide circle around the gunshot wound. Gabriel didn't flinch. He just watched her, his eyes tracing the contours of her face, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. "Why did you leave Northwestern?" he asked suddenly, his voice strained as she took a scalpel and made a clean 4-inch incision extending from the bullet hole. "This isn't the time for a therapy session, Costa," she muttered, grabbing retractors to pull the flesh apart. The blood immediately began to well up, dark and fast. "Distract me," he ground out, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges of the metal table. A low groan escaped his lips as she probed deeper. "Tell me, why a surgeon of your caliber is patching up gangsters in a basement?" "Because at least gangsters are honest about being monsters," Natalie shot back, grabbing a suction tube to clear the blood pool. "The board of directors at my old hospital let a 12-year-old boy die of a ruptured appendix because his parents' insurance lapsed. They smiled and called it policy. I'd rather deal with a bullet wound than a boardroom." Gabriel let out a breathless, pained chuckle. A woman of principle, a rare commodity in Chicago. "Shut up and breathe." "I found the bleeder," she said. It was a hepatic laceration. The bullet had clipped the edge of his liver. It was dangerous, but fixable. I have to clamp it. "This is going to hurt." Gabriel squeezed his eyes shut. As Natalie clamped the bleeding vessel, his entire body went rigid. A guttural scream tore from his throat, echoing off the tile walls, mingling with the screeching of the blowtorch cutting through the door outside. "Hold still!" she yelled, pressing her forearm across his chest to keep him pinned. For a moment, their faces were inches apart. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the sharp scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the coppery tang of blood and adrenaline. His eyes snapped open, locking onto hers. In the agonizing intimacy of the moment, the mafia boss and the rogue surgeon stared at each other, tethered together by the frantic beat of their hearts and the imminent threat of death. "You're beautiful when you're bossy, doctor," he whispered, a smirk fighting through the absolute agony on his face. "And you're delirious from hypovolemia," she replied, her heart hammering against her ribs as she began to suture the torn liver tissue. "Doc!" A muffled shout came from the door. It wasn't Sullivan's men. It was Leo, her medic. "Doc, are you in there? The cops are here. The CPD brought SWAT." Sullivan's men are scattering. Natalie froze, the needle midway through Gabriel's flesh. Sirens, dozens of them, wailed from the street above. The flashing blue and red lights filtered down through the shattered basement windows, casting an eerie glow over the smoke-filled ruins of her clinic. Gabriel's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist again, stopping her from moving away. His grip was weaker now, but still insistent. "Listen to me," Gabriel rasped, pulling her closer. "The police will arrest you. They'll take your medical license. They'll throw you in federal prison for harboring Sullivan." "I didn't harbor him. He was dumped on me," Natalie argued, panic rising in her chest. "The feds won't care. To them you're a mob doctor," Gabriel said, his eyes urgent and piercing. "Finish the stitches. Get me on my feet. You can't walk, and we're surrounded by SWAT." "My extraction team is here," Gabriel said, nodding toward a heavy, unmarked grate on the floor at the back of the OR. It was the drainage system that connected to the old Chicago freight tunnels. "They've been waiting under the city. Finish the sutures and come with me." "Come with you?" Natalie stared at him like he had lost his mind. "Into the mafia underground? Are you insane?" "If you stay, you lose everything," Gabriel said, his voice a hypnotic, dangerous command. "If you come with me, I protect you. You become mine, my personal physician. Nobody in this city will ever touch you. Not the police, not Sullivan, not God himself." The blowtorch abruptly stopped. The sound of heavy tactical boots and the shouting of police officers echoed in the hallway. "Chicago PD, drop your weapons, get down." "Make a choice, doctor," Gabriel whispered, the bloody smirk returning to his lips. "The cage or the king." The sparks from the cutting torch rained down like a miniature meteor shower against the heavy steel door. Outside, the distorted, amplified voice of a SWAT commander echoed through a bullhorn, demanding immediate surrender. Inside, time seemed to fracture into excruciatingly slow splinters. Natalie stared at the bleeding mafia boss. Gabriel Costa's proposition was madness. Fleeing with a syndicate leader made her an accessory to a dozen federal crimes. But as she listened to the aggressive pounding of boots and the unmistakable cocking of police-issue assault rifles, a chilling realization washed over her. These weren't honest cops executing a righteous raid. The Chicago Police Department didn't deploy a fully militarized tactical unit to a suspected underground clinic in less than 12 minutes without prior intelligence. Someone had pointed them here. Someone had known exactly where Hector Sullivan was bleeding. "They aren't here for me," Natalie whispered, the needle trembling in her fingers. "They're here to finish Sullivan's job, to make sure you're dead." Gabriel offered a tight, blood-stained smile, his eyes flashing with a predatory gleam despite his pallor. "You catch on quick, Doctor. Captain Higgins of the 6th District has been on Sullivan's payroll for a decade. If Higgins's men breach that door before my extraction team, neither of us walks out alive." "Damn it," Natalie swore, her medical ethics warring with her primal need to survive. She dropped the needle driver, her hands moving in a blur as she aggressively taped a thick layer of sterile gauze over Gabriel's freshly sutured abdomen. "Hold this. Tightly." She scrambled away from the surgical table, her shoes slipping on the blood-slicked tiles. She rushed to the back corner of the room, throwing aside a heavy stainless steel supply cart. Beneath it, secured by a heavy iron latch, lay the rusted grate Gabriel had pointed to. It was an old access hatch to the forgotten Chicago freight tunnels, a sprawling subterranean network built in the early 1900s, long abandoned by the city, but apparently repurposed by its most dangerous denizens. With a frantic heave, Natalie pulled the latch. The grate creaked open, revealing a pitch-black abyss that smelled of damp earth and stale metallic air. Suddenly, a beam of harsh, tactical light shot up from the darkness, blinding her. "Gabriel!" a sharp voice echoed from below. A man climbed halfway up the iron-rung ladder. He looked strikingly similar to Gabriel, the same sharp, aristocratic features and piercing eyes, but he wore the sleek, dark, tactical armor of a highly funded private military contractor. "Lorenzo," Gabriel grunted, using the operating table to drag his heavy frame across the room. Every step left a terrifying smear of crimson on the white floor. "You took your sweet time." Traffic on the Kennedy Expressway was brutal. Lorenzo shot back, his eyes darting to Natalie. "Who the hell is this? Where is Leo?" "Leo is compromised or dead," Gabriel said, leaning heavily on Natalie as she rushed to support his weight. "She is Dr. Brooks. She's coming with us. She is under my absolute protection." "Is that clear?" Lorenzo didn't argue. He grabbed Gabriel by the belt, practically hoisting the massive, injured man down the ladder into the darkness. Boom. A concussive blast rocked the operating room. The reinforced door groaned, the titanium deadbolts buckling under the force of a breaching charge. Dust and pulverized concrete filled the sterile air. "Go, now!" Gabriel roared from below. Natalie didn't hesitate. She swung her legs over the edge and scrambled down the rusted iron rungs just as a second deafening explosion ripped the heavy steel doors entirely off their hinges. As Lorenzo slammed the heavy iron grate shut above them, plunging them into darkness, Natalie heard the boots of the corrupt tactical team swarming the operating room. "Clear," a heavily armored officer shouted above them. "Target is, wait. It's just Sullivan on the table. Costa is gone." In the subterranean gloom, Lorenzo switched on a pair of high-powered night vision goggles. He hid a detonator in his hand. A massive electronic hiss echoed through the tunnel, followed by the sound of sparking wires and heavy, immovable steel. "Magnetic locks engaged," Lorenzo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "They aren't opening that grate without a laser cutter. We have 20 minutes. "Move," Gabriel rasped, slumping against the damp brick wall of the tunnel. Lorenzo hoisted his brother over his shoulder, and the trio began to move rapidly down the cavernous, arched tunnel. A sleek, modified electric utility cart waited 50 yards away in the shadows. Natalie ran alongside them, keeping her fingers pressed to the carotid artery in Gabriel's neck. His pulse was weak and thready. "He's lost too much blood. He's going into hypovolemic shock. If we don't get him volume replacement in the next 10 minutes, his organs will begin to fail." Lorenzo hauled Gabriel into the back of the utility cart, tossing Natalie a heavy trauma bag. "Everything you need is in there, doctor. Type O negative, pressure infusers, epinephrine." As the cart sped silently through the labyrinth of the Chicago underground, Natalie went to work. She was no longer in a sterile operating room. She was in a damp, moving tunnel, operating by the dim red glow of the cart's interior lights. Yet, she moved with the confident precision she had learned studying the texts of the legendary Dr. John B. Murphy, the historical Chicago surgeon who had famously operated on Theodore Roosevelt after an assassination attempt. Murphy had championed the idea of surgical adaptability, and right now, Natalie was the embodiment of it. She spiked a bag of blood, squeezing the pressure infuser to force the life-saving fluid into Gabriel's collapsed veins. "You planned this," Natalie said suddenly, her eyes snapping up from the IV line to Lorenzo, who was driving the cart. The pieces of the puzzle were violently snapping together in her mind. "You didn't just stumble into my clinic. Gabriel didn't just happen to get ambushed." Lorenzo didn't turn around, but a cold, hard chuckle drifted back to her. "My brother is a very convincing actor, Dr. Brooks," Lorenzo said. Gabriel, pale and sweating on the makeshift stretcher, let out a weak cough. "I told you, I am not just a gangster, Natalie." Natalie stared at the two men. "What are you talking about?" Lorenzo reached into his tactical vest. He didn't pull out a spare magazine or a knife. He pulled out a heavy gold badge and tossed it into Natalie's lap. It was an emblem of the United States Department of Justice. Lorenzo Costa, Deputy Chief, Organized Crime Task Force. Natalie's breath hitched. "You're a federal prosecutor?" she gasped, looking from Lorenzo to the mafia boss bleeding out beside her. "But Gabriel is. He runs the biggest syndicate in the Midwest." "Gabriel runs the syndicate that I allow him to run," Lorenzo corrected, his voice hardening into steel. "For 5 years, Hector Sullivan and his corrupt network in the CPD have strangled this city. They own judges. They own the mayor's office. Standard law enforcement couldn't touch them without the investigation being leaked by dirty cops. So you created a monster to hunt a monster, Natalie whispered, staring at Gabriel's smirking face. Hard karma, Doctor, Gabriel rasped, reaching out to weakly trace the line of her jaw with his blood-stained thumb. Sullivan thought he was pulling the strings, but tonight he took the bait. He ordered the hit on me, exposed his loyalists in the CPD by sending them to your clinic, and left his entire operation vulnerable. As we speak, Lorenzo interjected, turning the cart sharply into a wider, brilliantly lit access bay. 300 federal agents are sweeping the city. We have Higgins on a federal wiretap ordering his SWAT team to execute a rival on American soil. Sullivan is currently waking up handcuffed to that operating table, surrounded by my federal agents, not his corrupt cops. Natalie was stunned. The mafia war that had blown her clinic to pieces was a carefully orchestrated federal trap. Gabriel had knowingly walked into an ambush, risking his own life to draw out the rot in the city's foundation. You used me, Natalie said, a flash of pure, unadulterated fury igniting in her chest. She glared down at Gabriel. You knew I'd save Sullivan. You used my clinic as the bait. I didn't know they would bring him to you, Gabriel countered, his voice losing its smirk, replaced by an intense, desperate sincerity. But when my men tracked him there, I knew I had to go in, not to kill him, to make sure Higgins's hit squad didn't kill you to tie up loose ends. The utility cart screeched to a halt inside a heavily fortified underground garage. I locked the doors to keep the wolves out, Natalie, Gabriel whispered, his hand tightening around hers, and I asked you to save me, because you're the only person in this city pure enough to do it. 4 weeks later, the morning sun over Lake Michigan painted the sky in brilliant strokes of gold and bruised purple. The light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling bulletproof windows of the Costa family estate in Lake Forest, illuminating a medical bay that made Northwestern Memorial look primitive. Natalie stood at the stainless steel prep counter, reading a digital chart on an iPad. She wore a tailored, slate-gray dress, her white lab coat draped elegantly over her shoulders. She was no longer the exhausted rogue surgeon scrubbing blood off a basement floor. She was the chief medical director of a private, multi-million-dollar health initiative quietly funded by the Costa family to treat the city's most vulnerable populations above ground, fully legal, and untouchable by corrupt city politicians. Your vitals are completely stable, Natalie said, not looking up as she heard the soft tread of leather shoes entering the room. The hepatic tissue has regenerated beautifully. You are officially cleared for normal physical activity. Gabriel Costa stepped into the light. He was dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit, the picture of devastating lethal elegance. The pale shadow of near death was entirely gone from his aristocratic features. He looked like the king he truly was, a man who ruled both the shadows and the light. Normal physical activity? Gabriel asked, his voice a low, rumbling purr that sent a familiar shiver down Natalie's spine. He closed the distance between them, gently plucking the iPad from her hands and tossing it onto the counter. That sounds incredibly boring, Doctor. Natalie crossed her arms, trying to maintain her professional scowl, though the corners of her mouth betrayed her. Don't push it, Costa. I spent 3 hours putting your liver back together. I will not hesitate to dismantle it if you ruin my handiwork. Gabriel chuckled, stepping into her personal space. He reached out, his strong, warm hands resting on her waist. Sullivan was officially indicted this morning. 72 counts of racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. Captain Higgins took a plea deal and rolled on the entire corrupt command staff of the CPD. Lorenzo must be taking a victory lap, Natalie murmured, looking up into his storm-gray eyes. Lorenzo is a politician, Gabriel dismissed softly. He gets the glory on the news. But the streets know who orchestrated the fall. They know the vacuum has been filled. And they know the devil of Chicago is alive and well, Natalie said, resting her hands flat against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of the heart she had refused to let stop. The devil, Gabriel murmured, leaning down until his lips were a breath away from hers, is entirely at the mercy of his guardian angel. He kissed her. It wasn't the frantic, desperate collision of two people trapped in a blood-soaked basement. It was a slow, consuming claim. It was a promise forged in the fires of an underground war, A declaration that she was no longer a civilian caught in his crossfire, but the queen of his complicated, dangerous empire. When he finally pulled away, Natalie's pulse was racing, her clinical composure utterly shattered. "My private jet is fueled and waiting on the tarmac," Gabriel whispered against her jaw. "I have a sudden need to see the Amalfi Coast, to test this normal physical activity you prescribed. Come with me." Natalie looked at the man who had torn her world apart, only to hand her a better one on a silver platter. She had saved his enemy. She had saved him, and in the process, they had saved each other. "A doctor's work is never done," Natalie smiled, grabbing him by the lapels of his Tom Ford jacket. "Lead the way, boss." Did this pulse-pounding medical mafia romance leave you breathless? If you loved the twists, the tension, and the ultimate hard karma, hit that like button. Share this story with your fellow romance and thriller addicts. And don't forget to subscribe for more heart-stopping, original narratives that plunge you into the dangerous, passionate world of the underground.